Hi, everyone. Welcome to another mental health speaker series presented by Heading Health. I am Sally Twellman. I am the dietitian at Heading Health, and I am joined by our amazing psychiatrist, one of them up in the Dallas area, Dr. R.F. Noorbaksh. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, Sally, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, it's not really my show. I don't know why I say it like that. I'm so glad we could have this conversation.
Yeah.
And today is going to be a really, really interesting conversation. It is technology and mental health, the good, the bad, and the nerdy. And so I just think it's going to have it's so appropriate for what we're dealing with in our society right now. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Noorbaksh. Dr. Noorbaksh specializes in interventional psychiatry, utilizing treatments outside the conventional psychotropic medication. He approaches treating psychiatric disorders holistically, taking into account past life experiences, medical comorbidities, and treatment history. He also uses a multimodal approach to treatment, using traditional pharmacologics, neuromodulation, neuromodulation. Cut that out, okay, editor. Interventional approaches such as Spravato, ketamine, nutrition, and a variety of psychotherapeutic interventions. Dr. Noorbaksh holds an MD from the McGovern Medical School at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, where he trained at the Texas Medical Center. He also holds a BS from the University of Texas at Austin in neuroscience. Go hook 'em horns. He also completed his residency in psychiatry at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. So he has done so many really amazing things in psychiatry, and I'm so excited to have him here today to talk more about technology, the good, the bad, and the nerdy. So thank you so much for coming. And as we get started, I want to hear more from you about your history with psychology, what brought you into psychiatry specifically, and why this topic you feel like is so important for us to talk about today.
Yeah, so I've actually kind of always been interested in kind of biology, especially neurobiology, how the brain works, ever since I was in high school and even undergrad. And so that's been kind of a focus of mine. I feel like it's one of the most complicated things in the universe, the brain. And so trying to understand how it works and how it gives rise to all these amazing things that make people is really fascinating. And so that's something that I've always kind of been interested in. And when I went to medical school, I elected to kind of just naturally, psychiatry was a good fit. I also talk way too much to make a living doing anything else, really. So in medicine, so I elected to go down this road. But it's on another note, mental health, and psychiatric disorders specifically are things that are really impactful to individuals and to like the communities we live in. Depression is the biggest cause of disability worldwide. It's also a very hard thing to treat. It can be very complicated. There's a lot of reasons why these things occur, a lot of different ways to approach treatment of them. And treatment needs to be really customized to patients. So there's a lot of I wouldn't call it creativity, but a lot of flexibility in how we approach what we do in mental health. And so that it's not really an algorithm.
For sure.
Yeah, it's fun. I really enjoy it, and I find it just to be really impactful and really important. And so, yeah, here I am.
Great. Why is technology something that you really wanted to touch on right now?
So I think in the last few decades, especially, so I'm from the generation where, I remember us getting our first computer, right? And I remember us getting our first modem, and I remember this thing called Telnet, and all these, from the very beginning, and I think I'm one of the first generations where I've been able to watch kind of how this has changed, society from before to after. Whereas kind of the newer generations haven't really seen it. It's always been present. Things like the internet, social media, et cetera. And it's kind of picking up pace. And I think it's a source of anxiety for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is something that is profoundly influencing how we interact with each other. It by virtue of how pervasive it is, must have some impact on our mental health. And so understanding what those impacts might be and being mindful of them, I think, are really important.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, we as humans have been evolving for millions of years, and our very primitive brain is having this new input within the last 30 years that is unprecedented. And like, I'm also from the generation that I remember when like chat rooms first came out. I think I was in like junior high, and I was like, what is this chat room business? Like, I don't understand how you like go onto the computer and you wait, and then you like, why would anybody want to sit and type a conversation? And now it is like such a big part of it, is how we communicate. It's how we're communicating right now, which is really amazing, but it is something that our brains have not really been wired to do. And really, for us, you as a mental health provider, learning how to parse out that, I think, is really, really going to be interesting as it continues to unfold.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed wholeheartedly. Yeah.
So what have you seen as you began looking through the data, as far as like, what do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to maybe be concerned about regarding mental health and technology?
So unsurprisingly, there is a lot of kind of ongoing research into this, right? It is an area of active research. It's a question that a lot of people have, but also unsurprisingly, it's really complicated to study. So how we go about studying, interactions with things like social media, for example, or technology, period. It's a very difficult thing to do, and mental health studies generally are hard studies to do from a kind of a philosophical standpoint. Like, how do you approach it? And then just logistically, what are you actually measuring, and how are you going about doing it? And so it's hard to get good solid data. But what we have seen over the last, since the mid 2010s is that rates of mental illness have been increasing. So rates of things like depression and anxiety, we definitely saw a huge increase in those things during the pandemic period, which we're not quite out of, but it kind of feels that way sometimes, And so most concerning to me, because I've worked with adolescents quite a bit in my career, is that starting around 2010, we started to see a pretty big increase in the rate of suicide attempts among adolescents in this country. And elsewhere. And so, but it's very concerning. There's been a lot of questions as to whether social media plays an impact on especially adolescent mental health. And so that's been a really big area of research for a while. because nobody's quite sure what's causing these changes, right? And so we can, I guess, start with social media, because I think that's kind of one of the big areas that a lot of people have questions about, especially parents. When you're look, yeah, you see your kids on Insta, on Snapchat, on Facebook, and
don't forget
I,
TikTok.
and TikTok, yeah, and so I think I think a lot of parents, and I get this question quite a bit actually, is like, how much is too much? What should I be looking out for, et cetera? Should I be worried, right? And the answer is, we're not quite sure. But there's some trends and some things to look at. And so in some of these studies, how we engage with social media has been shown to make a difference. So people who, especially adolescents who kind of passively consume social media. So we call it kind of like doom scrolling, for example, on Twitter is what some people call it. And there's other words for it, but you're just kind of sitting there scrolling, looking at posts, etc., versus people who are more active with like posting content. There are differences, and passive use of social media tends to produce more negative mental health outcomes in certain people. So it's unclear whether we're causing that by doing that, or whether it's people who consume passive social media tend to already have depression or other traits that are important, but that's definitely something to look out for and think about.
When we were preparing for this, you mentioned that, and it really stuck with me. And the thought that came to me, and I wonder what your thoughts are about this. The people that are posting on social media have a sense of importance, where they're like, oh, people want to hear about what I have to say. Where people who don't, beyond getting the feedback that my life is less than yours, or what I'm doing is less fun and exciting than what everybody else is. But do you wonder if maybe they, like you said, they already maybe are a little depressed, or they have a diminished sense of importance or value that gets further exacerbated watching those things?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. So one of the phrases that I came across in some of these studies that I thought was really interesting was they call it kind of the compare and despair pattern of thinking. So you're scrolling through this stuff, you're seeing all these posts of your friends in like Cancun or wherever having these awesome lives, and you're comparing that to your own, and it's eliciting kind of negative comparisons and negative self-talk that can be problematic, right? And so that's something to watch out for as we engage with these services. And I think there is potentially a difference between people who tend to consume social media in that way versus people who are actively posting about these things, right? And it's hard to say that one is causing the other, right? But I think it's important to know that these patterns exist, and for people to be more aware of how they feel or how their usage is making them feel when they're engaging with these kind of services or engaging in these activities.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
You also mentioned something around like social distortions, cognitive distortions. What do you mean by that social media is reinforcing some of those things?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting studies kind of looking at patterns of thought. So we know that there's this whole theory of theory in psychology called cognitive behavioral theory. And so this is kind of the idea that thoughts precede emotions. So patterns of thought can cause these emotional responses, and those things affect how we behave, right? So thoughts come first, basically. And so how we think is important. And so one example of this is like black and white thinking versus kind of more nuanced shades of gray kind of thinking, which, most things in this world are nuanced and very shades of gray. And one of the things that social media and other technology platforms are really good at is curating content based on algorithms so that you're more likely to click on it more. And our brains are more likely to click on things that we agree with, or rather than we disagree with. And so reinforcing those patterns of thinking and seeing this content that we already agree with can kind of make us feel a little bit differently about the world. The world might seem a little bit more black and white than it does shades of gray, right? And so kind of understanding that and being aware of it as we consume, our Facebook, news feeds or whatnot is an important thing to keep in mind, I think, for everybody who's looking at social media.
Does it also, I feel like I heard somewhere that negative stories, images, they are stickier than positive things. So social media definitely makes things very hyperbolic, that will continue, or that will add to the sense of doom and gloom, and I must search up more things.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's kind of an evolutionary thing, right? So if you think about it from like a keeping us alive and safe standpoints, the things that are, a danger to us are tend to be a little bit more salient and stick a little bit more than the things that are not, right? That's also actually more true with people who are experiencing depression. So we know that people who struggle with depression or experiencing active depression very often have what we call a negative cognitive bias. So they respond to negative events, negative stimuli more robustly than they do positive events or positive stimuli. And so I think for someone who is struggling with depression specifically and other mental health concerns, this may be even more of an issue to be aware of. But it is true that those things are sticky. Like if you look at my Nextdoor is one of the few social media that I do use. And if you look at it.
Were you reading my mind? I was
right.
thinking of Nextdoor.
Yeah, it makes it kind of sound like from the posting that, the post that my neighborhood is kind of this like crime ridden, it's all that's going on out there. And for some of the posts that people make, it seems like that's how it makes them feel. And that's not actually an accurate reflection of reality, right? And so it's important to be aware of that point too. I agree. I agree.
Well, and I see a lot of that with, so I'm a mom and I have kids and I have lots of conversations with other moms, and something I felt like was always a little baffling to me. I mean, not baffling, but a little bit, it was something I took note of, I guess, was conversations with other moms about like fear that their kids would be taken, even walking through our neighborhood. And so I remember doing research just to find out, like, is the incidence of kidnapping going up? Like, what's happening? And it really wasn't. And it's just that you hear about those things more everywhere. And so it sticks more in your mind. And as parents, that is something that we just like, we think, well, that's a preventable thing. I will not let my child walk to school. And I live like a fourth of a mile from my elementary school or my kids' school. And there were people in my local area who wouldn't let their kids walk. And that just, it made me sad for them. And it made me sad for their kids, because it just like, that's a lot of anxiety that you're carrying around all the time based on the information that has been curated for you by Facebook, because they want as many or Facebook, Twitter, whatever your platform of choice is, they curate information based on what you've clicked on, because they get rewarded based on clicks. And that's something that we have to not forget, is like, it's a free platform for us to use. And so you always have to wonder, where is the reward? Not that it's good or bad. You just have to wonder why are they doing this? But I have thought a lot about the paranoia that is fed for parents, and that really decreases the ability for people to let their kids be kids and be out in playing outside, and there was this whole free range kid movement. Did you hear about this
Yeah,
a few years
I
ago?
have.
And I
Yeah.
thought that was hilarious because it's the idea of just letting your kids play. And I think we're about the same age. And
Yeah.
I would leave in the morning and I would be gone literally all day until
Yeah.
it started getting dark outside.
And that's the way it kind of was in the 70s and 80s. I was kind of a Stranger Things kid myself, on the bikes, out in the neighborhood. It for some reason, I think, and I even perceive this, it feels less safe than it used to. The data, because I've looked at this too, doesn't bear that out. Things are actually better in a lot of ways. And so it kind of begs the question of why do we feel that way? And I think a big part of that answer is it's way more visible. That information is a lot more accessible. You're not just getting news from like the nightly news every night, or the local news. You're able to read every little thing that happens on a feed someplace, and it can feel a lot more scary. And to your point, I think people who try to monetize this, and that's their business, know that fear is something that drives engagement, and so it's something just to be aware of as we engage. Yeah.
Sure. So you were talking about kids, and you did mention that there was like no hard and fast rules around how much we should limit. How should we engage with social media?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think as a parent, it's important to just stay engaged with our kids. That can be hard at times, but especially as they get into adolescence, and they're evolutionarily wired to not want to be engaged with us and to go and form their own identities and rebel. But I think it's important for them to have that trusting foundation they can fall back on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just keeping that line of that non-judgmental line of communication, where they know they can come talk to you about whatever might be going on, that there's not going to be a lot of anger elicited if something that is upsetting for a parent comes up, and that happens constantly because it's scary for parents. And so just keeping that line of communication open, I think, is really important, so that what your kids are doing online. And I think especially for younger kids whose identity may not be as cohered, and it's a little bit harder to navigate these kind of interactions, watching out for kind of the really big red flags, like the bullying. So, it used to be before, that you might get bullied at school, you could come home and it was done, and you had a respite from it. That's not really the case anymore a lot of the time. It's different. And so just being aware of that as a parent, having a little bit of insight and oversight into it, I think is very helpful. I do know that there is some data, that suggests, when they look at gender differences in adolescents in their social media use, because when you just look at screen time across the board, there's not a huge difference in mental health outcomes, right? There is kind of at maybe the very far end. So you do have adolescents that are addicted to gaming or other things genuinely, and that is problematic. But how we use those screens is important. That's what the data kind of says. And what's kind of really interesting to me, actually, is there's a gender difference. So boys, it turns out, tend to just kind of game a little bit more, and they're not necessarily as exposed to some of that more damaging social interactions that girls might be exposed to, because they tend to, on average, use more social media to engage with peers, especially in adolescence. And so you see that there is a difference there in terms of screen time and mental health outcomes, because how they're using screens is different. Mm-hmm. And so being aware of what kiddos are doing on the screens, how they interact, is important. I don't think getting rid of social media is the answer, because conversely, there is some data that suggests that if you take it away, kids feel very isolated from their peers, because that's how everybody's engaging nowadays. And so that in and of itself is also damaging. So I think the important thing is to try to strike that balance by being open and aware and communicative with children about what they're doing, why, and helping them be a partner in navigating those interactions.
Mm-hmm. Is there a good, like, based on the research, is there a good like start time, like when kids should be allowed to have some of these, or engage, I guess is a better word, with some of these social media platforms?
Yeah, I think it's no. The answer, the research doesn't have like a definitive age.
That is unsatisfying.
It is, isn't it? I know. Yeah, this is, research in psychiatry is very often not definitive. But what I will say is that I think it probably really varies by child.
Okay.
I think it depends on kind of psychological development, security, kind of if they have a kind of a secure attachment to parents and themselves, so they can have something safe to fall back on. Just kind of emotional development. We all vary in that as we grow up. Nobody's the same, and so everybody's experience is different. And so I would say it's kind of really a kiddo specific kind of call. But what I will say is that I think it's just important to kind of be aware of how the child is using social media and what they're being exposed to, as that becomes a part of how they use technology.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about us? I mean, we've talked about kids. What about adults and their use of social media? What does the research show about that beyond the passive versus active scrolling? Do you have any other insights about that?
So in the adult world, it's not as clear cut. So there's the data for adolescents is a little bit more robust, just because everybody's very concerned in the child and adolescent mental health world about this increase in suicide attempts. And so there's been a lot more research into causes and thus use of social media and other forms of technology. I think in the adult world, a lot more of the data and research is looking at kind of what people are being exposed to in terms of like the feeds and the algorithms and the curated content, and how that is changing how adults perceive the world. Is it reinforcing the beliefs they already have? Is it helping adults understand kind of, more nuance or not? And how that's affecting things like political discourse, and engagement with politics and other things, which I think a lot of people are also very concerned about right now. There's no hard and fast data on that, but there's some to suggest that, like, in fact, people are getting a little bit more. It's a lot easier to find kind of a clique of people online that believe what you believe, and that being kind of like a self-reinforcing little bit of like an echo chamber, where it's easier to be, feel secure in those beliefs when it may not be an accurate reflection of all the nuance and gray there is,
Sure.
in this world. So something that adults should kind of look out for too, across the board. Social media, TV, news, cable news. I mean, it's all important to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like the social media, there is really a good side to that, because you can create tribes and you can find people that you resonate with, and that will make you feel good about some of the differences that you have. But it's just about being able to notice when something is a little dysfunctional or not. So it's so interesting. It's important to be insightful.
Yes. Yeah.
Know thyself, right? As they say.
Yeah. And being mindful about how we think and how we feel after we engage with these things, because it's always, it's always a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, and speaking of other double-edged swords, so something that I do want to also talk about is the transition into the work from home culture, because that definitely has its benefits for some people and has its disadvantages for some people, for everybody, benefits and disadvantages for everyone, I guess. So what does the research say about this new trend, this forced trend with COVID, but this new trend into working from home?
So I find this very interesting. I've actually done a lot of reading about this because it was one of the biggest like forced, almost, I don't want to say a social experiment, but it was one of the biggest forced changes in how we interact with each other in a very long time. And it happened basically overnight. And so there was a lot of ability to compare, what was going on before versus after this kind of, work from home wave hit with COVID, and look at mental health outcomes. And yeah, the answer is very much a mixed bag. So I think there's definitely a huge amount of positives. Everybody struggles with work-life balance, right? You got your family to take care of, kids to manage, a whole bunch of things that you got to get done at home. And so being able to balance those things seems like would be a lot easier by working from home. One of the biggest changes is now there's a whole host of jobs available to people with disabilities that wouldn't have been available before, a whole host of jobs available to rural communities that wouldn't have been available before. So those are all great. Less commutes. Who wants to sit in a car for hours a day and waste gas, just like, going nowhere. So there is a lot of positives. But on the flip side, a lot of studies now have looked at this and seen that for some groups of people, this has actually been had a lot of negative impacts on mental health. And those tend to be people who are either like single, maybe work was a source of kind of camaraderie and socialization and networking opportunities that they no longer have. And so kind of people who are single, live alone, younger potentially, are newer to their careers and need that kind of in-person mentorship. Those things are definitely missed. And so this actually caused kind of an increase in some groups in things like depression, anxiety, work-related stress, feeling isolated and alone in your worry about work-related things. The water cooler talk is important. The kind of, random unplanned run-ins with people and interactions that you have. And so I think, again, kind of like social media, while this has had a lot of positives, it also has a lot of negatives for some people. And that ends up being kind of person specific. And so being aware of that for yourself, I think, is really important. In the last year, I've been able to kind of compare working at home exclusively to kind of doing a more hybrid type approach. And I've noticed just even for myself, when I'm at home all day, every day working and don't go to an office and interact with people, it does affect my mental health to a certain extent. And so I think, and that's why I kind of elected to transition, right? And so I think, again, awareness, mindfulness of how we feel, maybe why we feel, what might be helpful for that, and trying to take small steps to get to a place that maybe is better for us is the way to go.
Are there certain, beyond what you mentioned as far as like being single, being young in your career, are there certain like personality traits or pre-existing differences, I guess, that would predispose someone to be more sensitive to the work from home difficulties or disadvantages than other people?
Yeah, so I think I haven't seen any like, no, totally. I haven't seen any like conclusive, solid research on that, like personality traits that might impact kind of this decision. But I think they definitely exist, right? People are very different. There's some people who don't need that kind of work-related interaction. That work-related interaction might be a source of stress for them, for example. There are many people that may fall into that category. And so this work from home trend has been very helpful. And so I think being mindful of kind of what your needs are in terms of not only a job, but kind of just that social interaction that we get, because work is such a big part of our lives for I think the majority of people, that I think trying to have a better sense of what would be best for us from a psychological standpoint. It's very often it's about kind of like title and kind of the salary and benefits, and those things are all really important. But what's important for us psychologically, one, knowing what that is hard, but finding a work environment that fosters those particular things for each individual, I think is really important. So kind of know thyself, which is hard in and of itself. And then,
yeah, it's so interesting. It reminds me back to the pandemic time, and there were lots of like things on Instagram where it would be people talking about being introverted versus extroverted, and it was like introverts were like, glory be, this is the best thing to ever happen to me, and like this is my new normal, or this is my always, or whatever. And it was very funny because I am very extroverted, and it was very difficult for myself. I have kids, I have husband, so I was very lucky in a lot of ways, but my social interaction outside of my little core group was shrunk down. And I love my family, but it was a lot of family time.
Yeah. It's important. We are a communal species. Most of us, do best if we're in kind of feel like we're part of a larger supportive community. And that community is not just always the nuclear family. For some of us, it needs to be larger, myself included. I agree with that. And so it's really important to have that. I kind of struggled with the same things. It was very difficult to be at home all day, every day.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of communal species, we just going back to social media for a second, I think that we have gotten into a slippery slope of we need personal connection with people, like real connection, real like space. And you can definitely speak to this better, but like it seems like as humans, we have to be with other humans, having conversations in the same room, spending time together. And I think sometimes think that when we post on Facebook or we comment on people's posts or we whatever, it feels like enough of that connection that we think we're getting all those needs met, but really our bucket is never being filled. Is that true?
I think I would agree with that. And so what I'll say is that, so posting on social media, interacting through social media and through things like text messaging and, these other forms of communication that we use all day, is helpful. It helps us feel connected sometimes in some ways. Certainly my mom feels a lot more connected to my life following my photo feed and all that. And that's nice. We have a family text message thread, and because we're all over the place, and it helps us feel connected. But there is something very different, both from on a psychological level and on a physiological level, with how we're using our brains when we're actually looking at somebody and engaged in a conversation. It's actually one of the most difficult cognitive tasks that we can do as human beings. It involves a whole bunch of different parts of our brain. We're doing a bunch of different things at once when we are engaged in a face-to-face conversation. We are assessing body language, facial movement, so all those nonverbal things. Picking up on those cues. We're processing speech, formulating our own speech. There's just a whole bunch of things cognitively that happen when we engage in conversation and dialogue. And so, posting, while it's efficient and it's helpful sometimes, it's not the same kind of dialogue as an actual face-to-face conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Makes sense. So, sorry, going back to working from home. Sorry, I'm very much like, what are some of the other things that will trip us up besides the lack of conversation and communication and things like that? What are some of the other bugaboos that get us stuck?
I think there's a few, but I think the biggest one that people struggle with is while it's helpful in allowing us to strike a work-life balance maybe more efficiently in some ways, because we can, we're not stuck in our cars commuting for an hour. We can kind of, in between a meeting, kind of move the laundry from the washer to the dryer real quick and get that process continued. It's also very easy for the inverse to happen, for work to start blending into our family lives and time that should be downtime. And so that blurring of those lines between kind of work life and home life can be really problematic. And I think it's very important to strike that balance. And so, like, I know for me personally, I have some rules around this. I do my best to stick to them. I violate them more often than I'd like to admit, but past a certain time, I don't go into my office. That's kind of the work zone, and then I stay outside and maintain my home life out there. So I try to keep it physically separated, and that helps me keep it emotionally separated. Because there is no longer a physical separation. As people, we're very contextual, right? Being in the workplace is not the same as being at home, and having those two things being separate makes it easier sometimes to emotionally disengage. But working from the dining room table might make that really hard. And so it's important to kind of have some boundaries around that, so you can relax, you can decompress, and meet all of your other needs and not just satisfy work needs.
Yeah. So that's really great. Besides setting boundaries for yourself, what are some other things people can do to help with the work-life balance, the work from home difficulties?
So I think there's a couple of other things that I probably would recommend. I try to do these, in my own life. One of them is I think the biggest one by far probably is work from home really kind of means sit at home and work a lot of the times. When I used to work at places like in hospitals or other places, I'd be getting like a ton of steps per day. And sitting here in front of a screen all day can that's definitely not the same. And so getting up, taking breaks, moving around, etc., can be really, really helpful. I know there's some people who use like there's little stationary bikes that aren't that expensive. You can put under your desk to kind of help maintain physical activity. And so I think that's a really important part, because if you just being able to work from home means that you might not really have to leave your house very often, if at all. And so kind of getting out of the house, getting away from things, changing the environment every now and then, I think psychologically could be very good. And so that's something that I would think about as well. So kind of physical activity, but also kind of changing up the scenery, making sure that you keep the social interactions fresh. It might take a little bit more effort because you're not engaging socially at work. You're at home to actually keep those social engagements, fresh. But I think that's really important to kind of help maintain that balance. And again, the boundaries, maintaining boundaries, what's work, what's not, and making sure that you're satisfying your kind of non-work needs as well.
Yeah. Well, and just one side note that made me think about what you just said. After COVID, it was really hard. You were talking about how hard the conversational piece is between humans. When my children were home, when they were then released to be able to go do stuff, they were very much like, how do I go ask my neighbor to play? I don't know if I feel comfortable asking someone to hang out. And it has been really kind of an uphill battle to kind of push them into going and doing stuff. And I say just them, but even like my husband, we both just got out of the practice of like having people over. And so it's, once you stop doing something, the inertia of going back and doing it is sometimes very painful. And you can give yourself a out to not do it, but it's so important. And it's so refreshing to like have people over or go out to dinner, even though it does take a little more effort. It's really good. It's good to remind myself that doing that is so good for my mental health.
I totally agree. Kind of just bringing it back to something we were talking about earlier. We are kind of a community based kind of, species, really. And yeah, I think as a species, we got like really rusty on this point over COVID. I know I did, and it is hard to get back in that, to kind of develop that same, because we're also, we're used to patterns of behavior, and we kind of this pattern was imposed on us externally of like, you can't do anything, you can't see people, otherwise like horrible things might happen, and they might have, and so it was scary, and so I think trying to get back into that, it definitely requires some deliberate action and acts on all our parts to keep us going.
Yeah, for sure. So another thing I would love to hear your insight on is gaming, and gaming in all its forms. There's so many different types of gaming. There's like the gaming on the consoles. There's what is that little Candy Crush? I see people sitting at the table in the restaurant, like candy crushing. They're all crushing. So what does the research say about gaming?
Yeah, so gaming in and of itself is not a bad thing. Okay, I think gaming can be enjoyable, can be pleasurable, it can be fun. We all enjoy games of different kinds, and so I think as a whole, gaming is just fine and can be really awesome. And in fact, you want to get kind of, again, we got to add some nerdy to this because of the name of the talk. So there's some like really cool studies on surgeons who actually play like video games, like console games, and their hand-eye coordination is so much better that they like make less surgical errors in the OR. So there's like concrete evidence that gaming is good, at least in some capacity, aside from just as enjoyment. But there can definitely be drawbacks and downsides, kind of like social media. We just need to make sure we maintain awareness about how we engage with these things. And so we talked about kind of addictive potential. That is something that happens. People do get addicted to gaming. It can be kind of a psychological escape. But one of the things that our brains are really primed to, one of the things that can cause our brains to really want to re-engage in a behavior is when we get intermittently validated by that behavior. So if we get like intermittently prized, not prized every time. So you don't get like a treat every single time you do it, but it only happens sometimes. Kind of like gambling, right? Kind of like a slot machine. That's why slots can be so addictive for some people, is because you pull that lever and you don't know what's going to happen, but you might win. And you win just often enough to keep that going. And so those kind of patterns are important to be aware of in gaming. And there are certain kind of types of games that kind of use that mechanism to keep people playing. Some of the biggest culprits of this are like, free to play games. There's a lot of free to play games. That's fine. But very, very often they have kind of a mechanism by which you can buy certain things in that game that may or may not give you a reward of like a super high value. Sometimes it's low, sometimes it's high. And that kind of thing can really, for some people, be problematic and turn into problematic type behaviors. So that's something to watch out for and be careful about. But we can also use this to our advantage, right? So there's like apps that turn things like dieting, and I don't like the term dieting because I think that's the wrong way to think about it, but like more healthy eating habits into
lifestyle management or
lifestyle modification into something that is kind of what we call gamified, right? And there's other behavioral things, ways of modifying behavior through kind of the application of technology, gamifying that behavioral change that does really kind of help people institute positive change that helps them get closer to whatever their goals might be, right? Because those things can be hard sometimes. And so it's not universally bad, but it's like how we engage with it and what the result is and how we feel afterwards. That's important to be aware of. And again, it all comes back to mindfulness. And being aware of how we feel and what we're doing as a result of how we're behaving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So interesting. So what about sleep? How does this constant barrage of technology, TV, phones, like this sleep has also been something that we are slowly like going downhill.
Yeah. I've never seen a study that shows that like screen time makes sleep better, barring one exception, which I'll tell you in a second. But there are a lot of potential ramifications to this, right? Our brains need to kind of decompress, slow down, get away from things that are anxiety provoking, get away from work, get away from all those other things. Like I know personally, I turn off, like I don't get Slack notifications after a certain hour because I don't want to see work stuff. And so setting limits around those things I think can be really helpful. On a very physiologic level, screens tend to produce, white screens tend to produce a lot of blue wavelength light that is very close to the light that comes naturally from the sun. And it's close enough that it kind of tricks our pineal gland that makes melatonin and regulates our sleep-wake cycles. It tricks it into thinking that it's daytime when it's not. And so you'll see like a lot of phones now have like a nighttime mode where it gets really orange. Laptops can do that now too. There's actually good data to suggest those things are effective. If you have to use screens, if it's like really orange, and which means the blue's been kind of taken out of it, that's why it turns orange, is less likely to mess with circadian rhythms. So that's one thing for people to be very aware of, I think. I'm very aware of
that. I have the dark mode on my phone, but I've never heard of the orange mode.
Yeah, so there's like a dark mode that makes things like darker versus white, but there's also kind of like a nighttime mode on a lot of phones and laptops. There's like apps you can download that'll do this for you that kind of make the screen a little bit orange to help not disrupt sleep-wake cycles as much. So that's kind of a physiologic thing to think about. On a psychological level, yeah, the stimulation can be very difficult for a lot of people, and so I think it's very important to kind of be aware of how that stimulation affects your ability to fall asleep. Because for a lot of my patients, initial insomnia, which means kind of not being able to fall asleep, is a problem that's caused by these like ruminative thoughts. So we're just thinking about anxious things. Very rarely are we lying in bed unable to sleep thinking about like amazing things. Okay, it's usually really problematic stuff that we're worried about. And I think it's normal. It's where our brains are trying to keep us safe. But if we're engaging with that content on our phones or other devices, that can just compound the problem. Now, what I will say as far as sleep goes is that it is a problem for a lot of people. And there's a special kind of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, so CBTI, that has been shown to be as effective as medications like Ambien, which are very effective
Wow.
medications for a lot of people. Yeah. And there's some apps that can really help guide you through CBTI principles to help improve the quality of sleep. I know like the VA has one, for example, the Veterans Affairs Administration. The VA has one. It's free for like everybody. I don't think you have to be a VA patient to get it. That is quite good and can help guide you through CBTI modules to help improve your sleep. And there's others out there too. So,
Oh, wow.
again,
Maybe we can link that in the show notes below.
sure. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have gone over so many really interesting aspects of how we work with technology. And you've given so many tips. Do you have any more pro tips about how we can keep our mental health healthy and well during this time when we're learning how to navigate in this new world of technology?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to be mindful of how anytime we use technology, how it makes us feel. I think it's important to just know how we feel generally, and that is actually much harder than it sounds. It's easy to say, much harder to do. But developing that skill of like checking in with oneself and knowing how we feel is actually very protective against certain mood disorders. It can be very helpful in helping us navigate how we use these things. So say, if you're, scrolling through, whatever feed, and you find yourself feeling more and more despondent or upset or frustrated, or you finally put it down and you feel like that, I just feel drained. It might be worth just taking a second and exploring that for a minute to understand maybe why, and see if what we're doing or how you're engaging with these things is actually helpful or not.
Yeah. And not
so
allowing your brain to go to the like, oh, my life is lame. Instead,
yes.
maybe like challenge that thought and think to yourself, maybe my life isn't lame. Maybe social media just makes me feel a little crummy.
Oh, totally. And I'm a big fan of like gratitude exercises. I think they're really helpful. I actually do this myself every night before bed. 3 things that I'm grateful for, and it really helps me feel much more positive and grounded. But aside from the mindfulness aspect, I think the other really important thing is that technology allows us to not have to engage with people in a way that is the same as our brains evolved to do. And so making sure that we maintain our social interactions, don't let them kind of wither up, kind of continue getting out of the house, seeing people, engaging in that dialogue that's so important, feeling like we're part of a community, of people around us that can help. I think those things are all really important to keep in mind. And then I think the last thing that I really want to kind of emphasize again is kind of just for parents, making sure that we stay very connected and open with our kiddos. So making sure that they feel like they can come to us, talk about these things all the time, be vulnerable in front of our kids. That's okay. So they can be vulnerable in front of us and those kind of things.
Yeah. And then specifically talking about the increase in suicide attempts with this, I think it's really important to remind people that it's good to have that open conversation using the word suicide. I know lots of parents may be worried that they're introducing those thoughts to their kids, but from the research I have seen, and you can speak to this more, one of the most important things is to bring it up and just talk about it. And that is something very tangible that you can do that opens up that dialogue in case kids are having those thoughts.
Yes, so and this is a concern for a lot of parents, this idea of like kind of planting this thought. And the data suggests that that's not true.
They're already having those thoughts. It's already been planted. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So I think what the data does suggest is that for kids who are having those thoughts and are struggling with significant depression, not talking about it makes them feel isolated, misunderstood, abnormal in some way, which kids are already, their, self-image is tough at that age.
Yeah.
And especially in adolescence. And so helping them feel less vulnerable and less isolated by discussing those things in a way that's non-judgmental, I think is really important. Now, I'll put one kind of caveat on this, in that there is data to suggest that if one of these events does happen, like in a school environment, the rates of subsequent events does seem to, at times, this is a kind of a phenomena where it increases. Yes, and so why that happens is unclear, but avoiding discussing it is definitely not going to be helpful or protective in preventing potential attempts. I think it's just very important for parents to be very open and honest and discuss these things in a way that helps teenagers feel understood, especially teenagers that struggle with their mental health. Like most teenagers do at some point. It's tough. It's tough being a teen out there. So
it's hard. I remember it's hard being a teen, and now I think it's even trickier, as we have talked about. Well, you have given so much kind of scary information. I'm just kidding. It was great. It was very informative, but I know that there are some good things about mental health. So do you want to tell us more about what are some of the benefits that you have seen, maybe even specifically around mental health from this new explosion of technology?
Yeah, it's definitely not. It's definitely not all bad. Like I said, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We need to be mindful, but there are really huge benefits for a lot of people in terms of mental health. And I think the biggest one, COVID drastically changed society in a lot of ways, and not most of it was not fantastic for us. But one of the biggest benefits that came out of COVID is that the rapid deployment and access of telehealth services generally, and telehealth services in the mental health space specifically. So prior to COVID, virtual appointments with your psychiatrist or therapist were like, that was kind of a rarity. And it was such a rarity that it was very difficult to get insurance to even pay for it. And now that this has kind of happened, and it's become so popular and so important, and has kind of very clearly demonstrated the benefits of access, it's never going away. Insurance is now going to pay for this kind of as a standard thing moving forward. And so availability of these services has really, kind of exploded. And I think that's just net benefit across the board. The other, I think, kind of big benefit of technology generally is that, we talked about kind of that CBT for insomnia app. And there's a variety of other apps that have kind of come out to help people kind of track, manage, and engage with their mental health symptoms in a way that is maybe more productive. Because it's very easy when you're struggling with these kind of symptoms to kind of self-deprecate and emotionally self-flagellate and feel bad about what you're doing and all these things. And so, again, changing the way we think can change how we feel and how we behave. And changing the way we think is hard. But there are a lot of apps now that can help us accomplish those things. And so we talked about the CBTI app. One of the first ones that hit the field, I remember, and I think this was a while ago now, was Wobots. I don't know if people remember this. And so it's kind of like an AI where you would go, give you like a little bit of a CBT lesson for the day. It'd take a few minutes. And so you could talk through things like, it would walk you through an exercise about things like should statements. Whenever you hear should, your ears should perk up a little bit. No pun intended. So it's so it's kind of indicative of ways of thinking that might not be as adaptive or as helpful and more likely to elicit negative emotional responses, right? And so there are a lot of apps that can help us with this. That's something to kind of look for. And then, I think there's a lot of cutting edge stuff. I know we're trying to do some of this stuff at Heading. Maybe in the future, we're exploring certain things. We're always exploring ideas here to try to improve kind of outcomes and help our patients, get to where they want to be. And because that's the goal. And one of the biggest ones, and I think one of the things that is sometimes hardest for me as a clinician and for patients, is to kind of keep track of symptoms, and catch a relapse of, let's say, depression earlier rather than later, because we know earlier intervention means we can I kind of think of depression as like a boulder that's rolling downhill, and the longer it rolls, the faster it's going, the harder it is to slow down, and the longer it's going to take. And so the earlier we can catch it and intervene, the better the outcome might be, the less severe the relapse might be, because that's a normal part of depression is relapse. It happens all it's part of the disease process. And so there's a lot of experimental or a lot of research into what we call behavioral phenotyping. So it turns out that just with our phones, and this sounds a little bit big brother, but there's a lot of ways to do this in a way that protects privacy. We can predict when somebody is at high risk of having a relapse of their psychiatric disorder by how their phone use changes. So how often they're leaving the house, right? How late they're staying up using their device. How early they pick it up and start using it, because people are using it all the time. How much physical activity they're getting, because most phones now have a little accelerometer and can measure movement. And so if you're more sedentary, that can be a potential kind of red flag that depression might be worsening. And so if we can gather this data and help patients, send them a message and say, if they've been doing well for a really long time, hey, it looks like you're kind of, something's changed. Mind taking a quick screener? Let's see where your symptoms are and get them into treatment sooner, back into treatment. That would be really ideal. And so those are kind of things that a lot of people are exploring in this space to try to leverage technology to help us improve our mental health and be more aware and mindful of our mental health as well.
That's so interesting. Do you think people would be interested in having their lifestyle tracked like that?
I think it sounds I think it sounds scary for a lot of people, because I think historically the way that businesses and other entities have protected privacy is not great, right? And I think people have reason to be a little bit scared. But I think there are some ways to do that in a way that protects the patient and protects their privacy. We already do that very well with medical records generally. And so I think that's one way to do it. And I think there also is a little bit of we forget how severe of or how debilitating depression is, both for individuals and for society at large, right? Again, this is the biggest cause of disability worldwide. And so I think there's sometimes in the mental health space, maybe a little bit, we feel like the bar should be higher for some reason. Or this should be more, if it was a different disease process, we might think about it differently. So for example, if there's something like, life-threatening, like a cancer, recurrence, for example, if there was some technology where we could predict that, early and get people back into treatment early, I think people would be all about it, right? Because that's scary.
Sure.
But depression is scary too. And it definitely is debilitating. And I think it's something that
has a risk of death.
It
also
does.
has a risk
It
of
does.
death.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And so I think just how we think about mental health generally as a culture and a society, if we kind of put it, a little bit higher up where it should be, I think it would be important to do that. I think people would be more accepting of things like this to help manage these kind of disease processes.
Yeah. Well, so interesting. And there are so many ways to get help. And one thing I have seen, because both of us have worked in the mental health space before COVID, after COVID, and the explosion of accessibility, especially in the far-flung areas of Texas. We live in Texas. The tiny towns that don't have psychiatrists, they can contact us at Heading and be seen. They can contact us and see a therapist for all different modalities of therapy. And so I think that has really, really been a huge benefit to people, because it allows, and I think COVID has also destigmatized a little bit about mental health, and it's made it more acceptable to talk about and seek help.
Yes.
And so that it's been really nice to be able to work for a company that provides care to people in tiny towns that didn't previously have access to really good quality psychiatrists and therapists. So
Agreed.
that is definitely a benefit. Well, thank you so much for our talk today. It has been so informative to me, and I hope that it is really helpful to everybody listening. If you have questions about how to find treatment, we will have links below about how you can seek care, either in for more long-term care or emergent, if that's what you need. But thank you so much for spending the last hour-ish with us. And we will be back next month with another speaker series. So thanks again for joining me, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thanks.